The woman gripped her phone firmly as she spoke sternly to the police dispatcher. "I'm telling you, there's a black kid causing trouble in my yard." Her voice was tight with a mixture of fear and self-righteous indignation. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the quiet suburban street, piercing the tranquility of a late summer afternoon. The sharp, insistent wail of sirens echoed through the air, cutting through the calm like a jagged knife. In the middle of it all stood Daniel Johnson, a 12-year-old boy, standing next to a police cruiser, his face pale and drawn, his hands visibly trembling. Around him, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion, their hushed whispers filling the air with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. This was how it all began, a chain of events set in motion by prejudice and fear, a moment that would forever alter Daniel's life and expose the deep-seated biases that still simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic community. Daniel, a bright, polite boy who had just moved in the neighborhood with his single mom, loved basketball more than anything. He was always eager to make new friends, but was shy by nature. He could often be found outside their modest new home, practicing his dribbling skills and perfecting his jump shot, his dreams of playing college ball fueling his relentless dedication. That's exactly what he was doing on this particular afternoon. He was working on his crossover dribble when the basketball, with a rogue bounce, escaped his control. The orange sphere bounced out of his driveway and rolled across the street, coming to a stop in a neighbor's yard. It wasn't a big deal, a minor inconvenience that anyone, regardless of age or race, might encounter. Or at least, that's what Daniel initially thought. He walked to the edge of the yard, his voice polite and respectful. "Hello. Excuse me? My ball's here," he called out, hoping to retrieve it quickly and avoid any unnecessary confrontation. But no one answered. The house remained silent, the windows dark and uninviting. Daniel hesitated, a flicker of unease creeping into his mind. He didn't want to cause any trouble, didn't want to be seen as a nuisance in his new neighborhood. He glanced around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching, his anxiety rising with each passing second. When no one emerged from the house, he took a tentative step into the yard to grab his ball, his heart pounding in his chest. What Daniel didn't know was that someone was watching. Mrs. Patricia Harding stood at her window, her eyes narrowed, her gaze fixed on him with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. To her, it wasn't just a boy retrieving a basketball. It was something else entirely, a confirmation of her preconceived notions, a validation of her deepest fears. Patricia frowned, her mind racing with assumptions, fueled by years of ingrained prejudices. Who is this kid? She thought, her grip tightening on her phone. Why is he in my yard without permission? He looks suspicious. Without waiting to find out the truth, without attempting to communicate with Daniel, she picked up her phone and dialed 911. "Hello, police?" she said, her voice steady but sharp, laced with an undercurrent of alarm. "There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard. He looks suspicious. I don't know what he's doing, but I want him off my property immediately. Can you send someone right away?" By the time Daniel picked up his ball and started walking back to the street, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Sirens. Loud, piercing sirens, growing closer with each passing second. He turned and saw a patrol car pulling up to the curb, its flashing lights reflecting off the surrounding houses, casting an eerie glow on the scene. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle, their faces serious and professional. For a moment, Daniel didn't understand what was happening. Why were they here? What had he done wrong? He clutched his basketball tighter, his anxiety escalating into full-blown panic. The officers walked up to him, their voices calm but firm. "What are you doing here, son?" one of them asked, his eyes scrutinizing Daniel. Daniel clutched his basketball even tighter, his voice barely above a whisper. I just came to get my ball," he said softly, his eyes wide with fear. Before he could say more, Patricia stepped outside, her face flushed with anger, her eyes blazing with indignation. She pointed at Daniel, her voice louder now, laced with accusation. "That's him. He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says. That boy doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them turned back to Daniel. "Son," he said calmly, "is that true? Were you trespassing on our property?" Daniel looked down at his basketball, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't trespassing," he said, his voice shaking. "I was just getting my ball. It rolled into her yard." Patricia folded her arms tightly across her chest, her voice sharp and cutting. "Oh, sure," she snapped, her eyes filled with suspicion. "That's what they always say. It starts with a ball, and before you know it, they're scoping out houses, looking for something to steal." The weight of her words hit Daniel hard, like a physical blow. His eyes darted nervously from the officers to the growing crowd of neighbors and back to Patricia, his mind struggling to comprehend the injustice of the situation. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, a Kafkaesque scenario where he was being judged and condemned without any evidence, based solely on the color of his skin. Daniel's chest tightened, and he felt a lump forming in his throat. He opened his mouth to explain, to defend himself against the false accusations, but the words wouldn't come out. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, the eyes of the officers scrutinizing him, the eyes of neighbors peeking through windows, watching from porches, judging him from afar. "Why didn't you stay in your own yard?" the officer asked, his voice laced with impatience. Daniel blinked, confused by the question. He felt the weight of every gaze on him, waiting for him to say the wrong thing, to confirm their preconceived notions. Patricia folded her arms, her face smug. "I told you," she said to the officers, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "I knew he was up to something, but Daniel wasn't up to anything. He was just a boy with a basketball, trying to enjoy a summer afternoon in his new neighborhood. And now, he was being treated like a criminal, subjected to suspicion and scorn, simply because of his race." The officer, unsure of what to do, but pressured by Patricia's insistence and the growing attention of the crowd, made a choice. He told Daniel that he would need to come with him for questioning, that they needed to sort this whole thing out at the station. Daniel didn't resist, didn't argue. He knew that any attempt to defend himself would likely be futile, that his words would be twisted and used against him. But his voice shook as he asked for one thing, a request that revealed his innocence and his vulnerability. "Can I call my mom?" What Patricia didn't know, what the officer didn't know, was that Daniel's mother wasn't just any parent. She was Governor Elizabeth Johnson, the most powerful woman in the state, a force to be reckoned with, a champion of justice and equality. The phone rang in her office, interrupting a crucial meeting about education reform. Her assistant answered, her voice urgent. "Governor, it's your son, Daniel. He sounds distressed." Elizabeth's heart leaped in her throat. She excused herself from the meeting and grabbed the phone, her hand trembling slightly. "Daniel? What's wrong?" Ethan's trembling voice on the other end of the line told her everything she needed to know. He recounted the incident, his voice filled with fear and confusion, the details painting a clear picture of racial profiling and injustice. She didn't hesitate, didn't waste time on recriminations. She knew what she had to do. She made one call, then another, her voice calm but commanding, her instructions precise and unwavering. And within minutes, her convoy was speeding toward the neighborhood, a symbol of power and authority descending upon the quiet suburban street. The sirens began, not one or two, but a whole fleet of black SUVs barreling down the street, their lights flashing, engines roaring, shattering the peace and quiet of the afternoon. Patricia turned to look, her face twisting in confusion. What could this be? Why so many vehicles? And who were they here for? Her initial sense of triumph began to wane, replaced by a growing unease. As the convoy rolled to a stop, the door swung open, and out stepped Governor Elizabeth Johnson. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate. Her presence alone demanded attention, commanded respect. She was a figure of authority, a symbol of power, and everyone in the neighborhood knew who she was. But imagine Patricia's shock, her utter disbelief, when she realized the target of this extraordinary display of power was her, or rather, the situation she had created. She thought she was dealing with a simple case of trespassing, a minor infraction that required a swift and decisive response. How could she have known that the boy she accused, the suspicious black kid in her yard, was the son of the state's most powerful woman? Elizabeth's gaze swept over everyone present, the officers, the neighbors, Patricia, and then stopped on Daniel. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, her eyes conveying a mixture of concern and fierce protectiveness. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that cut through the tension like a knife. "What's happening here?" The officers hesitated, their professionalism faltering under the weight of the governor's presence. One of them cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Patricia. Governor Johnson," he said respectfully, "we were called here for a report of suspicious activity. This young man was seen on private property." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, her attention shifting to Patricia. "And you made this report?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Patricia, still struggling to regain her composure, nodded quickly, her earlier confidence evaporating. "Yes," she said, her voice quieter than before, laced with defensiveness. "I saw him in my yard. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, so I called the police. I thought it was the right thing to do." Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang in the air, her eyes never leaving Patricia, her gaze conveying a mixture of disappointment and disapproval. Then she turned back to the officers and said, "This is Daniel Johnson, my son. And what evidence do you have to suggest he was doing anything suspicious?" The officers glanced at each other again, clearly uncomfortable, caught between their duty to uphold the law and the power of the governor. Elizabeth's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Daniel, offering him a small, reassuring nod of support. Then she turned back to Patricia, her voice now laced with controlled anger. "So," she said slowly, her words deliberate and precise, "a 12-year-old boy retrieves a basketball, and your first instinct is to call the police? Is that correct?" Patricia sputtered, her hands tightening into fists, her face flushing with indignation. "I didn't know who he was," she said defensively, her voice rising in pitch. "He could have been anyone. And kids like him, they don't just wander into yards without a reason." Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped lower, sharper, more dangerous. "Kids like him?" she repeated, her words dripping with sarcasm. "What exactly does that mean, Mrs. Harding?" The tension in the air thickened, becoming almost palpable. The neighbors looked at each other uneasily, realizing the gravity of the situation, the weight of Elizabeth's words sinking in, exposing the ugly truth of their own biases. Patricia stammered, her earlier confidence now completely gone, replaced by a dawning awareness of the consequences of her actions. She realized she had stepped into a situation far beyond her control, and the fear in her eyes was now unmistakable. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice calm but commanding, her words resonating with the force of her position. "Let me be very clear," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You called the police on a child, you accused him without evidence, and now you stand here trying to justify it with assumptions that say far more about you than they do about him. In my opinion, you should be arrested." The crowd stood in stunned silence, the truth of the moment sinking in, exposing the insidious nature of prejudice and the devastating impact it could have on innocent lives. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, the balance of justice tilting in Daniel's favor. Elizabeth turned to the officers, her voice firm and unwavering. "I want this resolved," she said, her eyes conveying her determination. "And I want it done the right way. My son deserves better than this." The officers nodded quickly, their professionalism returning, their commitment to upholding the law reasserted. They understood the seriousness of the situation, the need to ensure that justice was served regardless of race or social status. Patricia, feeling utterly ashamed and exposed, mumbled a half-hearted apology. I'm sorry, Governor Johnson," she said, her voice barely audible. Elizabeth, however, was not interested in a personal apology. She stood, turning back to the officer and then addressing the crowd. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and powerful. "This isn't just about my son," she said, her words resonating with conviction. "This is about every child who's been made to feel like they don't belong. Every parent who's had to wonder if their child will make it home safely simply because of the color of their skin." The crowd that had gathered watched in silence, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: shame, regret, remorse, and for some, a dawning realization of their own biases and prejudices. This was more than just a neighborhood dispute. It was a moment of reckoning, a mirror held up to their own values and beliefs. For some, this was a moment of genuine realization, a catalyst for self-reflection and a commitment to change. For others, it was merely a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, the long and arduous journey towards a truly just and equitable society. And then, Elizabeth addressed the crowd directly, her voice filled with passion and conviction. She spoke not as a politician seeking votes, but as a mother protecting her child, as a neighbor appealing to their shared humanity, as a leader calling for unity and understanding. She talked about fear, the insidious power of fear to distort our perceptions and cloud our judgment. She talked about prejudice, the deeply ingrained biases that can lead to injustice and discrimination. She talked about the importance of seeing one another as human beings first, of recognizing our shared humanity, of treating each other with respect and compassion, regardless of race, religion, or social status. Her words were simple but powerful, resonating with the crowd and prompting a collective moment of introspection. "We all have a responsibility," she said, her voice echoing with sincerity, "to ourselves, to our neighbors, to the children who will inherit this world. Let's make it one where they feel safe, where they feel valued, where they feel like they truly belong." Elizabeth turned back to Patricia one last time, her voice calm, but her words carrying the weight of a promise, a warning that served as both a condemnation and a call to action. "Think carefully before you make assumptions like this again, Mrs. Harding," she said, her eyes conveying her unwavering resolve. "Because next time, it won't end here." Patricia's face fell, her earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of shame and regret. She understood the gravity of her actions, the potential consequences that she had narrowly avoided. For Elizabeth, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long and arduous journey towards changing a mindset, transforming a community, and ensuring that no other child would have to endure what Daniel had just experienced. It was a commitment to fighting for justice and equality, not just as a governor, but as a mother, as a neighbor, and as a voice for those who often went unheard. But the impact was undeniable. Patricia Harding, once so confident in her place in the community, so assured of her own righteousness, found herself increasingly isolated, ostracized by her neighbors, haunted by the shame of her actions. The whispers followed her, the knowing glances, the subtle acts of exclusion, serving as a constant reminder of her prejudiced behavior. Elizabeth, recognizing the need for systemic change, reached out to the local community association, proposing a series of workshops and discussions about bias, inclusion, and accountability. She wanted to create a safe space for dialogue, a platform for education and understanding, a mechanism for fostering empathy and breaking down barriers. Daniel, too, found a way to channel his experience into something positive. With his mom's encouragement, he spoke about what had happened to him at a school assembly, sharing his story with his peers and urging them to stand up against prejudice and discrimination. "I didn't understand why someone would think I was bad, just because of the way I look," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But now I know we have to stand up to that. We have to be better. We have to treat each other with respect, no matter what." What had started as a single incident, a basketball rolling into the wrong yard, became a moment of reckoning for an entire community, a catalyst for change that extended far beyond the confines of that quiet suburban street. Patricia Harding learned a painful lesson about the consequences of her actions, a lesson that would stay with her long after the flashing lights and whispers faded. She was forced to confront her own prejudices, to acknowledge the harm she had caused, and to embark on a journey of self-reflection and personal growth. And Elizabeth Johnson, she continued to fight, not just as a governor implementing policy, but as a mother protecting her son, as a neighbor advocating for understanding, and as a voice for those who often went unheard, ensuring that their stories were told and their rights were protected. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about one boy, one woman, or one neighborhood. It was a story about the power of truth, the courage to confront our assumptions, and the hope that together we can create a world where everyone truly belongs, where every child feels safe and valued, regardless of the color of their skin.